Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello and welcome to Madison's Notes, the official podcast of Princeton University's James Madison program in American Ideals and Institutions. I'm your host, Laura Laurent, and on this week, we have the pleasure of speaking with Professor Julia Mahoney in the second part of our Constitution Day celebration. Julia Mahoney is the John S. Battle Professor of Law and the Joseph C. Carter Junior Research Professor of Law at the University of Virginia School of Law, where she teaches courses in constitutional law and property law. Her recent scholarship includes articles on government, takings of property, the classical legal tradition in education, and feminism and the common good constitutionalism. She's a graduate of Yale Law School and is a member of the American Law Institute and serves on the board of advisors of the new Civil Liberties Alliance. She will be delivering the Antonin Scalia Constitution Day lecture this week for Constitution Day here at Princeton, but we have her on the show today to discuss her career in constitutional law, the meaning of Constitution Day, and numerous present-day challenges to the Constitution. So, without further ado, let's welcome Julia Mahoney to the show.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here.
So, first off, I wanted to ask you, since we're here for Constitution Day, what do you think is the significance of Constitution Day in today's context, and why should people continue to observe it?
I think our Constitution is an extraordinary achievement. It is, by most measures, the longest enduring Constitution in the world. It has always had an extraordinary capacity for renewal and for adjustment to circumstances. Even when we find ourselves in circumstances, as I think we do right now, where a number of people are very worried that our constitutional framework is not up to the task of engaging with the challenges that we face, so far, that has always turned out to be wrong. And so I take Constitution Day as a day to celebrate what has been achieved and also to look forward with realism, but optimism too, to what is to come.
So tell me, what do you believe are the elements of our Constitution that has allowed it to be such an enduring document? And are these the same elements that will continue to help it last throughout our current challenges?
Yes, I think it is clear. Remember that it is quite a short document, even with the amendments that we have added to it. Much of it is specific, and so it gives us excellent rules of the road. A lot of it, of course, is not specific. It has words that have very important concepts that can be imbued with a whole range of meanings. But our Constitution and the institutions that support the Constitution provide opportunities for our society to peacefully work out how we're going to interpret the provisions of the Constitution that are not fairly obvious on their face, and how, when things are not working, how we are going to change it.
On the topic of interpretations, some people argue that the Constitution should be interpreted as a living document, while others favor a more originalist approach. Where do you stand on this debate, and how do you think this impacts constitutional law?
I actually think that bright line does not exist. I would say that, along with, I believe, Justice Kagan commented, we are all originalists now, and frankly, we probably always were, in the sense that the original public meaning of the Constitution, often the intentions of the founders and other things that originalists pay a lot of attention to, have never been irrelevant in constitutional interpretation. Now, I think all would also agree that the Constitution and our understanding of the Constitution does change. It changes because we formally change it through the amendment process set out in the Constitution. It also changes because the Supreme Court, which has a very important role in explaining and determining what the Constitution means, the Supreme Court has changed its mind from time to time, and I think will continue to do so. And of course, the Supreme Court is not the only constitutional actor. Presidents are important interpreters of the Constitution too, and they have on many occasions made decisions that are at least somewhat in tension, sometimes even in outright contradiction, to decisions made by their predecessors.
In your view, what are some of the most pressing constitutional issues that courts or policymakers are currently grappling with?
What I'm going to talk about today in my Antonin Scalia lecture is the problem of corruption. And by corruption, I mean not only the sort of venal corruption, officials getting bribes, or someone entering into a contract with the government to purchase property at less than fair market price and so on, but I mean a broader definition of corruption. And interestingly, that's the most common definition of corruption that was used during the founding era. Sometimes this kind of corruption is called systemic corruption or systematic corruption. And in short, it arises when the government, often working with powerful private interests, will limit opportunities to engage in economic, social, and political life. I think that in the United States, it comes as no surprise that we have seen in the last 2 decades or so the rise of populist movements on both the right and the left. And a lot of what they complain about overlaps. That there's a system that is rigged, that opportunities are parceled out to insiders, and that the United States has become a less open access society. I think these complaints have a lot to them, and even though some of the remedies that are recommended, sometimes by populists, are, I think, possibly going to be, frankly, cures that are worse than the disease, I understand why there is a lot of frustration, even anger, in the United States right now. And I think it makes sense for those who know the most about the Constitution, who've thought the most about the Constitution, to address those concerns seriously.
And do you believe the Constitution is still able to meet this specific challenge of corruption? And if so, what are the key pieces of the Constitution that should be applied in considering this specific issue of corruption?
I think it's a very huge problem. Most societies have suffered from, and continue to suffer from, this kind of so-called systematic corruption, where there are significant restrictions on opportunities. The United States, of course, has been far from perfect, but if we look at the history of the United States, and even the American colonies that became the United States, before we had a United States, what we see is overall a very impressive positive trajectory of becoming a more and more open access society, a society that affords opportunity to more and more people. Now, of course, I don't mean to gloss over some of the grimmer events in American history. I think that does no one any good. And the way that we have become, I think, a more open access society is by, in effect, putting our Constitution to good use. We have expanded franchises. For example, which has been extremely helpful, we have addressed discrimination on grounds of race and sex. That has also been quite helpful. Our Constitution provides for divided power, which sets up multiple veto points, which makes systematic corruption more difficult. Impossible? Of course not. But it makes a lot of bad things harder when there are multiple veto points in the system, so that it is not possible to loot or abuse others by only capturing one part of the government.
Now, the Constitution has been amended 27 times, and in the most recent amendment, ratified in 1992, do you think that we're likely to see another amendment in the near future? And what issues do you think might drive such a change?
I think it's entirely possible. Note, when we look at the history of constitutional amendment in the United States, that the amendments have tended to come in waves. We saw a significant overhaul, of course, after the Civil War, the so-called Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. We also saw a spate of amendments during the Progressive era, the 16th Amendment providing for the income tax, the 17th Amendment providing for the direct election of senators, the 18th Amendment, Prohibition, which of course is the only amendment so far that has been repealed by the 21st Amendment. But in any event, yes, I think we could see a wave and so on. And what it would contain, I think, would depend on what the people want. That we can certainly imagine our hottest button issue, or one of our hottest button issues right now, the question of pregnancy terminations. We can certainly imagine that the politics will break more significantly in one direction or the other than it has so far. So we could imagine there could be either a pro-life amendment that would significantly restrict abortion, perhaps even recognizing personhood at some point in pregnancy before birth. We could also, of course, see things more acceptable to the other end of the political spectrum. Yeah. Same thing, I think, with from time to time we've seen proposals for balanced budget amendments, which from time to time gets very popular. Concern about national debt is will occasionally boil over. There are some amendments like to that effect in the state constitutions. I'm not sure they're all that effective, frankly, but again, that's something that I hear a lot about.
I'm curious, how have you seen constitutional law change over the course of your career, and particularly with the influence of new technologies and the changing social norms? Have you seen that have an impact on the field of constitutional law specifically?
I think the technologies that make historical research so much faster have had a huge influence. It used to take a long time to assemble even a smattering of sources in order to make out what we might loosely speaking call an originalist argument. Today, it is just extraordinarily easy to at least gather the sources. Now, reading them carefully and analyzing them, of course, the human brain has not advanced so that that's that much faster. But things can be things can be searched. Things can so that I think has been the biggest change, and it has made the legal opinions, particularly legal opinions from the United States Supreme Court, a lot more detailed and a lot more comprehensive, and I think considerably more accurate. Looking back at some of the constitutional law opinions, particularly in the 70s, 80s, even into the 90s, sometimes you see a lot of looseness and so forth. And I guess also actually thinking about it, the 1950s and the 1960s, even before, sometimes you just see a kind of conclusory pronouncement. You certainly would not see that today.
When you speak of looseness or precision, are you meaning that the rulings of the court are more closely aligned with the Constitution? Can you elaborate on what you mean by looseness?
I think they're more grounded in a number of sources, so that today, if you read an opinion from the United States Supreme Court, or an opinion from any justice for that matter, with rare exceptions, you will have an excellent idea of the sources that they have used to support their conclusions. And you will be almost always there will be provided a measured and subtle and helpful explanation of how great the reliance was on these sources. Contrast that with 100 years ago, for example, Oliver Wendell Holmes' now notorious opinion in Buck v. Bell, when he sustained the constitutionality of the Virginia statute that provided for mandatory sterilization with fairly minimal process. He cited just one case, Jacobson v. Massachusetts, and he, it appears, had not actually even looked at the case all that carefully, or at least there were some pretty obvious points to be made in response that he doesn't deal with. So you would not see that today, I think.
Yeah. No, that makes sense that there's been an increase of almost accountability as well as an increased amount of understanding for those who are not necessarily making the decisions to understand, like you said, the historical context. We were speaking on the way down here, and you remarked that your students, when they're excited about constitutional law, it's so much easier for them to gain access to knowledge about constitutional law, whereas before it would have been, as you said before, quite laborious. So
yes, and they are interested, and they listen to podcasts. They
like this one.
Yes, like this one, and they listen to Akil Amar's podcast and Will Bode, and there are just many, many podcasts, and they get information. And and as a professor, it's just wonderful that students are able to, when they go on walks, when they go on car trips and so on, if something excites them, they get to keep learning about it.
Yeah, I'm curious, as far as your teaching goes and your students, besides maybe access to information as they're learning, what are some of the largest differences between, say, your experience as a student in constitutional law and what you're seeing other young people experience? And are they bringing to the table anything unique or particular that's going to help them excel in this space?
I think it's very much of a piece with what we've just been discussing, that there is so much more information and analysis out there that it is clear that a number of arguments are plausible. When I went to law school, it was sometimes argued that a number of things had been settled. And I was among a number of people who thought, no, they have not been settled, that the conversation is going to continue. One hears much less often these days that anything in constitutional law has been settled for all time.
I know for myself, it's more interesting to walk into a space knowing that we're still discovering, not just discovering, but that there's still work to be done versus walking into a space and just learning the routine. So that's incredible that you're able to encourage that with your students and to help facilitate their growth in that way. I'm curious, when it comes to individual rights and freedoms, given the evolving nature of free speech, particularly within this digital age, do you think that the First Amendment is getting tested in any new ways? And how would the framers of the Constitution view these rights and how they would interpret them?
Well, the First Amendment is being asked to carry a very, very heavy load. And this is, I think, in large measure, a matter of historical accident. Once it became clear, during, roughly speaking, the New Deal era, that the Supreme Court was going to get out of the business, almost always, of defending individual economic and ordinary social rights against whatever the legislature wanted to do in terms of regulation of day-to-day life in the economy, that created pressure. Justice Gorsuch, I believe, has sometimes referred to this as constitutional hydraulics, where one avenue is cut off, potential litigants, and their lawyers will start searching for others. So it doesn't surprise me that a lot of what I think look most obviously like economic freedom arguments end up being cast as First Amendment arguments, because that's the most effective way to win. To me, that distorts the First Amendment, but it doesn't mean that the decisions are necessarily wrong. I think it's not the ideal way to go about things, but it doesn't mean that it's a terrible way to go about them.
Yeah, what's a strategy to help rectify this issue if the First Amendment might be misapplied in certain situations for personal or economic gain?
I'd say not ideally applied. I mean, after all, I would certainly say that being able to speak, write, etc. freely is absolutely crucial for any kind of human life, and or at least a human life that has the kind of value, has the kind of possibilities that we expect in the United States in the early 21st century, and that participation in economic life is a huge part of that. It is not true that the only speech rights people care about are rights to view pornography or even participate in political debate or listen to a public speaker or anything like that. Those to some, but they're also, I think, commercial speech rights can be terribly important in terms of people making their most valuable lives. Mm-hmm. But it does seem to me that that again, First Amendment doctrine has gotten extremely convoluted, and it has gotten to the point where it is difficult often for non-specialists to quickly or even slowly understand what is going on. And that in turn, I think, can degrade the quality of political debate. The uproar over the Citizens United decision I think is a great example of that, where the Supreme Court had actually, I think, had to decide between two competing lines of precedent. It had chosen one line of precedent. Maybe it was right, maybe it was wrong, but it was certainly, we could go back and forth, but it was certainly a defensible thing to do. But I think in part because the doctrine had become so complicated, the precedent so convoluted, that the quality of public discussion really suffered.
That's interesting to note. And I want to go back to something you said earlier about how we are all originalists in some sense when interpreting the Constitution, that we've always been originalists. Can you explain that to us a little bit more? Because I think if I were to hear that immediately and be not an originalist, that might be confusing.
Well, I'd say people have always been originalists in this way, that the understanding of the Constitution at the time of its adoption, the understanding of the principles that animated the Constitution, have never, to most Americans, I believe, been considered to be wholly irrelevant. There will be different judgments about how easy it is to apply overarching principles to new situations, but there are just not that many who have ever argued that the Constitution is, in terms of understanding what the Constitution says, that it is irrelevant what the history is, what the original understanding is, and so on and so forth. Even those who argue our Constitution now belongs on the ash heap of history, in terms of arguing what the Constitution actually does and doesn't do, I hear them making all kinds of comments that suggest to me, anyway, that they are aware of and paying attention to original public understanding as they criticize the Constitution and explain why it is now obsolete.
Yeah, I think it sheds a little bit of light into thinking that sometimes the discourse is more focused around, like you said, the application versus the values themselves. And maybe when one sees an alternative application that appears to be so contrary to one's own interpretation or application, it would be easy to believe that, oh, we must have completely different values, even though it's more so a issue of action applied to those values. So I'm curious, as far as the Supreme Court, it's taken on a larger role in shaping national policy in recent years. And do you think this is in line with the framers' vision of the judiciary role, or has it expanded beyond its original intent?
It's very difficult to know how powerful the Supreme Court is. As many have commented, it does not have a lot of access to money, right? It actually has to take what Congress gives it. It certainly doesn't have military forces. So the Supreme Court, not surprisingly, does not tend to get radically out of step with the political branches, the executive and legislative branches, or, frankly, with public opinion, as my old colleague, Michael Klarman, now at Harvard, has documented, I think accurately. It's not that there are zero deviations from public opinion in the history of the Supreme Court, and others have written, I think, very ably on this too, but they're not that common. When we see a really unpopular Supreme Court opinion, one reaction is, wow, this opinion is not stable. A great example of that is a case that I've written on quite a bit, and will frankly write on more as the 20th anniversary of it approaches, Kelo v. City of New London, a case about eminent domain where the Supreme Court sustained as constitutional the decision of New London, Connecticut, to take the homes of a number of people pursuant to an economic development plan. Now, when that came out, I was interested because there was a massive public outcry, and the opinion and the decision proved unpopular across the political spectrum. So when you think about what the Supreme Court actually does, I am skeptical that it is all that powerful. Can it make a difference on the margin? Of course. But one of its most important roles is to educate and persuade the populace, to educate and persuade to the legal community. So that's a kind of, the Supreme Court has soft power too, I would say, in addition to handing down its judgments and giving its orders.
What are your thoughts on the lower courts? If the Supreme Court isn't as powerful as we might think it is, or has a more diverse set of roles than we initially give it credit for, are the lower courts also meant to be interpreting constitutional issues that are quite serious? And how do you see the dynamic of the lower courts interacting with the power of the Supreme Court?
The lower courts are bound by a strong tradition of vertical stare decisis in our system. It may be that it is too strong a tradition. I myself think that it would be perfectly constitutional for lower federal courts to be a bit less deferential to the court when it comes to following Supreme Court decisions. But because right now it is rare for lower courts to do so, that is, to deviate from Supreme Court precedent, they don't have, or someone might, one can certainly argue that they don't have that much power or that much hard power. Again, though, there is soft power, particularly when lower court judges decide they will write separate opinions, in effect explaining why they think that the Supreme Court precedent that purports to bind them so strongly is wrong.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious, do you feel as though we have sufficient education and sufficient civic education, particularly allowing individuals who might be interested or even who aren't interested, the common person of the United States of America, do we have sufficient education to notify them of these subtleties?
I think we have a lot of educational opportunities so that anyone in the United States, just about, who wants to understand these issues in a thorough, sophisticated, and subtle way has the opportunity to do so, or at least get a long way toward doing so. I think we could make significant improvements in civic education, particularly at the K-12 level. I think that history as a discipline in higher education is in terrible trouble with collapsing enrollments, in part due to what I see as an ill-advised politicization of history at the college and university level. I also believe that a lot of our press outlets, including a lot of our most respected ones, could do a far better job in terms of taking its, I would call them, responsibilities. But they might resist that characterization. Mm-hmm. But I believe that in a democracy such as ours, with the power of the press, do come responsibilities. Not that I would say the government can tell them what to print. No, I'm a great believer in freedom of the press. But I think the press could take its job a lot more seriously.
Mm-hmm. What are some ways that we might improve this, or as an individual, what might you recommend for pursuing a wholehearted education when perhaps, like you said, history is not necessary is under risk at the collegiate level, and we can't necessarily look to our major press outlets to inform us correctly?
I think it's imperative on anyone who wants to gain a good understanding of our constitutional structure, as well as the possibilities of implementing it or changing it, to commit to get information from a wide range of sources, to consider arguments that might sound a bit puzzling, at least take a couple of seconds and consider them carefully, to try not to live in a silo where they only receive some kind of conventional opinion that they're used to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's interesting when social media was first sort of taking over our everyday lives. There was a lot of worry about, you only are in your own echo chamber, which is, of course, a risk. And then as it's been that way for long enough, I'm starting to see, at least among my peers, that since we recognize it's part of our echo chamber, we can start to use the tool differently, knowing that that's how it will respond to us. So, for example, having multiple accounts that have different that you assign different echo chambers and you follow different types of people, so it doesn't try to pinpoint you. So I think there's definitely a hope in adapting to some of the challenges that we might be finding as far as education and civic discussion. So I am curious, though, about your particular career path into constitutional law. What first drew you to a career in law, and how has your understanding of the Constitution specifically evolved over your career?
I was very curious in understanding how our system worked. So law school was a good first step for that. Then I practiced law, where I learned a lot about transactions and a lot about how corporations actually function. Then I had children, and while raising children, I began to work part-time. There was a need for teachers at the University of Virginia School of Law, and so I figured that I would give it a try. So I designed a couple of classes and enjoyed it a lot. And then I began writing. And I have always, in my writing, tried to look for areas where I believe there is a lot of interesting stuff going on, but there are not lots and lots and lots of people writing. And so I think I have done that, and I have focused a lot throughout my career, but particularly early on in my career, on property, which I volunteered to teach at UVA Law, and which I have taught most years now for 25 years. A wonderful course to teach. And I've had a particular interest in kinds of property that have values beyond their pecuniary value. Mm. And that, of course, is where a lot of the fiercest controversies come up, especially ones concerning eminent domain. I mentioned the Kelo case, one of the most controversial constitutional law opinions the Supreme Court has issued in, well, its entire history, actually. And one reason that opinion, I think, was so controversial was that it involved the taking of people's homes. And everyone recognizes that although, of course, one's home can be assigned and is assigned a financial value, that's not the only value of a home. Mm-hmm. And from that grounding, that kind of base in constitutional aspects of property, I've branched out into some other areas of constitutional law.
In specifically this area of eminent domain and assessing value that isn't a numerical capital value, how do you start to assign value or make that argument about that value when it is under risk of attack?
Well, generally with property, property owners don't have to part with their property if they don't want to. So I can certainly say to you, well, I've looked up the value of your bicycle, and the market value today is $1,000. So I'll give you $1,000 and you give me your bike. And you're just as well off with $1,000 because that's the financial value of it, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, you don't look like you're going along with this. Because the rule is that, with rare exceptions, property owners get to say no. Mm-hmm. And that is the way that our society, in effect, takes account of these non-pecuniary values. Now, of course, though, governments do have eminent domain power. Eminent domain is an inherent power of sovereignty. It is not our Constitution that has given any government eminent domain power. Governments have eminent domain power. And governments sometimes can delegate, or up to a point, they can delegate their eminent domain powers to private entities, such as utility companies, railroads, and the like. So when eminent domain power is exercised, and it is supposed to be exercised, of course, the Constitution says it can be exercised for public use. But defining public use has been quite difficult, mm-hmm. and continues to be quite difficult. So those whose property is taken as the result of eminent domain, who are entitled to, roughly speaking, the fair market value of their property, will understandably often feel that they've been undercompensated.
Well, and the reason I wasn't going along with your example is like, I love my bike. I wouldn't sell it for anything, which is probably is the exact feling that many homeowners probably have.
And yet, if I offer you $10 million for the bike, okay. I suspect I'm going to get the bike.
And you can have the bike.
And the same with most homes. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, that's not true for organs, for example. Necessarily. Possibly for kidneys.
Yeah.
And so forth. But there are plenty of people who will say that they, and credibly, I think, that they would not part, for example, with their gametes, mm-hmm. ova, sperm, for any price. Mm-hmm. There are certainly people who have been part of the formation of embryos that are kept in storage, who offered $10 million for their embryos, mm-hmm. would say absolutely not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we find those statements credible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's an interesting question for the listeners to ponder is, would you sell your kidney for $10 million? Your research explores the intersection of property rights and constitutional law. Can you tell us more about how these two areas connect and why they're important in shaping American legal perspectives?
Well, I think that a lot of the most interesting areas of constitutional law do involve property, eminent domain. We've already been discussing also questions of regulatory takings. There's lots and lots and lots of regulation of property. We have a lot of health and safety regulation, and so forth. And most of it is perfectly permissible, but there are, I think, very difficult questions about how much the government can place burdens on one or a small number of property owners in order to generate benefits that are enjoyed by society as a whole. So many have described the court's takings jurisprudence as a muddle, understandably. I actually don't think it's as much of a muddle as many others do, but I will admit that it's convoluted and often self-contradictory. Mm-hmm. These are very hard lines to draw. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's been a significant interest of mine.
Yeah, and how do these specific conversations affect other debates going on in the constitutional realm? Because, the Constitution covers so many different aspects of life, and what's the interconnectedness between them?
I think inevitably there is a bit of siloization in constitutional law, certainly in academia. A lot of among practitioners, I think maybe a little less.
Yeah.
So if you're asking, is it possible for one area not to be affected, or one area of constitutional law doctrine not to be affected by what's going on in an area that is arguably pretty closely connected? The answer is often yes.
That's interesting. How do you yourself balance between both studying past constitutional interpretations and also staying up to date with and analyzing the modern applications of constitutional law?
I think they go together.
Yeah.
And I think that one very important job of law professors is to be able to, in effect, translate from the past to the present, and perhaps most important, to the future. Mm-hmm. Law professors are, I think, very privileged to have a lot of time and a lot of resources in order to learn, reflect, and study. And it allows them, I think, often to articulate options for consideration. For example, where do we want to go in terms of our constitutional direction? Mm-hmm. I do not think the Constitution's future should be left up to law professors. And my guess is that that probably no one would disagree with me on that. Maybe a law professor too. But I think this. So I look at the job of academics as in effect being one of service.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious, what has been some of the most surprising and empowering moments of your career in law? You've had it doesn't seem like it was necessarily planned out, so I'm sure there were twists and turns you didn't expect. And I'm curious what some of those were that brought you a feeling of fulfillment or excitement or accomplishment.
I think when I began teaching, I thought I would like it, but I didn't know that I would find it so engaging and so energizing. And I guess another thing that has surprised me in a good way is that, in part due to the technological developments that you and I have discussed, there are just many more opportunities for interacting with people. Now, social media does have a downside, but I think the public square of X, formerly Twitter, is, at least if one chooses with some reflection, accounts to follow and so on, it actually is providing an enormous amount of substantive exchange that is only from time to time, I would say, really unpleasant. Mm-hmm. So that's been enormous. There are also and of course there are many more events that are online. I can watch conferences and so on from my computer, and that and attend to some, and then one gets feedback. So there's a lot more conversation going on, I'd say, than I had imagined that there would be when I first began. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, has been a good development. The people can test out ideas, get reactions earlier, and that makes studying and reflecting on the Constitution more of a collaborative process, which I think is very much in keeping with how the Constitution was hammered out. Think about the Philadelphia Convention, 1787. They're all locked up, or they're all not locked, but you know what I mean. They're all in a room without air conditioning, and they have brought plans, some of them, but they're discussing them, and it really is a collaboration. Mm-hmm. Then when the Constitution is sent out for ratification in the conventions of the states, there is a lot of substantive discussion, which then results in the adoption of the first 10 amendments, which I think is also quite interesting. So the ratification conventions, although told take it or leave it, you can't say, but then the conversation did continue, and it became clear that there were going to be some amendments, and so there were.
Yeah, I just think it's funny that X has become one of the places that is actually fostering civic discourse. When you're limited to so many characters, it's just ironic that that's where we're finding it. I'm curious, who are some of the thinkers or writers or colleagues who you most enjoy exchanging dialogue with, like the people who push you?
It is a huge list. I'd say the entire legal academy, and X does have character limits, but you can do a tweet, you can do a thread, and very importantly, you can embed documents, so that someone can. So a brief introduction is, I think, in a way, it is a good thing. Yes. To be limited in terms of the number of characters, because one has to think very carefully about how to explain the project so that those who are interested in it and who have knowledge about it will be able to know that they might actually, that it's for them. Exactly.
No, that skill of brevity is one that is, it's important, being able to actually disseminate what one is saying in long form into something that is communicable through so few characters.
Yes. Yeah. And many would say that law professors could use practice with brevity.
I'm curious, speaking of documents embedded in tweets, I saw one in doing some research for this talk of an article that you wrote for Law and Liberty back in 2022. Okay, so a while ago at this point, but it was titled A Common Good Constitutionalist Feminism. And I'm curious, can you give us just a brief introduction of common good constitutionalism, what it is, and its current dynamic in the constitutional studies realm, and do you think that it's still supportive of the modern women, as you argue in your article?
Potentially, yes. We don't, of course, know precisely what people mean by common good constitutionalism. It's certainly a new and exciting development. The idea that the Constitution is designed to and can promote the common good, that it is not just about securing individual rights, that it's not just about explaining which branch of the government should be doing what, when. I think for many people that resonates. At the same time, all the questions that arise don't have clear answers yet, or at least most of them, and maybe never will. Who will define the common good? Who will, in effect, decide what the remedies, penalties, etc. are? All that, I think, is very much in its infancy. Many critics of common good constitutionalism argued that it was backward-looking, that because it drew so heavily on sources of the classical legal tradition, including natural law sources, that it would, by definition, be oppressive to women, because those sources were the product of a time where women had fewer opportunities, fewer rights than they have today. And the piece I wrote for Law and Liberty was meant to push back against that, that one can implement, draw from, be inspired by the classical legal tradition without having to announce that United States society in the 21st century has got to look like Europe at the time of St. Thomas Aquinas, or the late 18th century, or whatever else it is that those sources are grounded in. The ability to extract powerful concepts from their immediate temporal and spatial circumstances is, I think, one of the most important skills that one can have.
As a professor of law, what are some of the key constitutional issues, that you emphasize when teaching to your students? I know that you have your own personal interests for your studies and your academia, and of course, I'm sure you present those to your students, but overall, when you're giving them their education, what are the most important pieces that you try to emphasize for them?
One important idea is that the Constitution is, in effect, an operating manual. students sometimes come to the study of constitutional law focused on individual rights, which is, of course, a very, very important thing to be focused on. But not surprisingly, they have learned much less about the nuts and bolts of the Constitution and how it allots power and how it is a blueprint for a functioning and ultimately thriving society. I ask my students to look very carefully at constitutional structure, to understand that the meaning of the Constitution can be derived not simply from text, although text is, of course, important, not only from history. History is, of course, helpful in terms of guidance, etc., illumination, but that where things are in effect look at how the Constitution has set things up is, I think, a crucial thing for them to always be aware of.
Mm-hmm. And that might not be something that they immediately understand through their K through 12 or undergraduate experiences, as that's just not always the way that the Constitution is sold in classrooms. So I think...
Do you think people would understand it if that were in junior high or high school? Or is it the kind of idea that you think people need to be in their early 20s, have had some life, early to mid 20s, whenever, had some life experience?
I think it would be an interesting thing to present to younger generations, because like you said, the individual rights is I'm reflecting on my own education, is really the fulcrum of the historical context that the Constitution was given to me in my education. No, I think it would be great to introduce that concept much earlier, because it gives a better understanding of the context, which is something that we are often lacking when thinking about American political theory. Looking back on your career, are there any specific cases or legal discussions or developments that you felt particularly validated or challenged your ideas about constitutional law?
Nothing comes to mind immediately. I did think from the time that I was in law school, back in the mid-1980s, that the Commerce Clause of the Constitution did not provide Congress with a general police power over the national economy. And I think that idea of mine, that conviction of mine, has been somewhat vindicated. I also thought, and I certainly was not alone in this, that Roe v. Wade, and then later on, when the Supreme Court handed down the Casey decision in 1992, I thought both those precedents looked very shaky from the time they were decided. Mm-hmm. And that no matter how often it was said, and it was said, that the Supreme Court had settled this controversial, difficult area of American politics, that there was no way for that particular institution with the tools at hand to settle the abortion issue. Mm-hmm. It could not be taken off the table of politics or of constitutional law. And I think that now, whatever the Supreme Court does or doesn't do in the area of abortion, I would be surprised to hear anyone, to hear any suggestion that now we're done. Now the court has spoken. Now the court has taken on the role of determining how things are going to be, and people are going to go along and just understand this is done.
Yes, the ethos of the American people is quite ripe for just accepting what the high court says and following it.
Yeah, that was I think not a realistic expectation.
Well, and in wrapping up, this has been a really wonderful conversation to understand you more and get some different perspectives on constitutional law and its context within the American political system. I'm curious, you're giving this talk tonight, and tell us, what are you, I won't make you recite the lecture here now, but what are you most interested to impress upon the listeners of the lecture this evening? I'm
most interested, I think, in impressing the idea that what was considered to be one of the central problems, that of systemic corruption, seemed to be, to many observers anyway, if not completely solved, at least it had gotten to be a fairly minor problem. And now, at least plausibly, in the 21st century, we appear to be, plausibly, not everyone would agree with me, but it is, I think, certainly worth considering whether we are facing, in effect, a resurgence of systemic corruption. The exact kind of systemic corruption, or at least, or something perhaps I should say, similar to the sort of systemic corruption that inspired the American colonists to revolt, and which was very, very important to those who were the original designers of the Constitution. And how are we going to use our Constitution, if we can?
Thank you so much, Professor Mahoney. This has been a really lovely conversation. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for tuning in on today's episode of Madison's Notes. We hope you enjoyed this mini-series on Constitution Day and have learned something new from our two speakers on the subject, Cass Sunstein and Julia Mahoney. Make sure to drop those thoughts in the comments section, and as always, share this episode with a friend or a foe. I'm Laura Laurent, and this has been Madison's Notes.